Welcome, my soft-thinking listener. You've found yourself in the company of the Sleepy Sloth once again. A slow, scientifically minded fellow, who enjoys the very slow, methodical history of candy, and things that taste sweet, yet carry a weight of time and tradition. I must tell you something before we begin. Today, I consider myself a scientist in the ancient confectionery arts. A scientist wannabe who is almost always correct, except for those few times when I am not. But even then, I prefer to drift gently onward, rather than fuss over it. Because what truly matters is the information itself. Before I start, please, let me know. What is the most boring thing you would secretly love hearing about? Let me know gently, in the comments. Now, let us begin today's episode of the history of very, very slow sweets. Around 1500 BCE, in the warm, sun-kissed lands of the Nile, ancient Egyptians began to experiment with honey-based confections. No one asked for this. And yet, here we are, meticulously observing the way honey, a viscous substance produced by industrious bees, was combined with figs, the dried, chewy fruit of Ficus carica, nuts that varied from almonds to dates, and aromatic spices such as cinnamon or maybe even a hint of coriander. Each confection was carefully shaped and sometimes pressed into molds of stone or clay, often for religious or ceremonial purposes. The honey itself, golden and thick, acted both as a sweetener and as a preservative, allowing these small treats to last longer than fresh fruit alone, which would have withered and softened too quickly under the gentle Egyptian sun. Additionally, some of these sweets were coated lightly with powdered resins or pollen, which added subtle textures and scents, enhancing their ceremonial significance. Honey's natural antibacterial properties were valued not only for taste but also for preserving small edible offerings for temples or for funerary rituals, making each bite a tiny testament to the Egyptians' careful observation of nature and patience in culinary practice. Let us drift, ever so slowly, to about 500 BCE, where the gentle Mediterranean lands of Greece and Rome saw the continuation of this sweet fascination. The Greeks, and later the Romans, enjoyed honeyed fruits and nuts, often in elaborate arrangements on small plates at banquets that were, for them, demonstrations of refinement. They used honey not only for flavor, but for its textural properties, creating sticky glazes and coatings that could cling delicately to the surface of walnuts, almonds, or dates, so that each bite was simultaneously chewy and slightly crisp. Honey was carefully collected from hives in clay pots, sometimes sealed with a thin layer of wax to prevent evaporation, and used to sweeten food and drink alike, infusing wines, barley cakes, and soft pastries with a slow, sticky sweetness that would linger on the tongue. The Greeks often combined these honeyed treats with small amounts of sesame seeds, crushed herbs, or even small pieces of dried figs or dates, adding subtle complexity to texture and flavor. Romans sometimes stored honey in amphorae for months, allowing natural fermentation to slightly deepen the taste, which they considered a mark of sophistication. Banquets might display honey-coated almonds as decorative offerings, both for their visual appeal and to encourage guests to nibble slowly, savoring the careful labor invested in each sweet morsel. But first, a slow little detour for this extra interesting fact. In both Egyptian and Greco-Roman confectionery traditions, the exact proportions of honey to fruit were rarely written down, and instead followed a tacit knowledge passed from one generation to the next, ensuring that each sweet was just the right consistency. Now let us float gently onward to 200 CE in the distant lands of China, where early sugar sculptures began to emerge. Here, sugar, often extracted from sugarcane, was boiled into thick syrups and then meticulously molded into delicate forms, sometimes representing animals, sometimes symbolic objects, and occasionally simple geometric shapes. These sugar confections were more than sweets, they were miniature objects of art, painstakingly crafted by hands that worked slowly and methodically, ensuring that no lump of crystallized sugar disrupted the smooth, almost glass-like surface. Techniques included heating, stirring, and shaping the syrup with small, precise tools, often under the watchful eye of a master confectioner. The Chinese recognized both the aesthetic and gustatory potential of sugar, combining it occasionally with nuts, fruit pastes, or natural flavorings, creating a meditative process of slow craftsmanship, where patience was as important as the sweetness itself. Each sculpture, though small, was an exercise in time, temperature, and texture, demonstrating a profound understanding of sugar's properties, its ability to crystallize, to melt, and to retain form. So softly we drift. To around 500 CE, where in the Indian subcontinent the practice of sweet-making blossomed into forms both familiar and deeply tied to ritual. Among the earliest known confections was kheer, a delicate rice pudding gently simmered in milk until each grain softened to a tender consistency. Sweetened at first with honey and fruit, and later with sugar as it slowly made its way into Indian kitchens, kheer carried more than flavor, it carried layers of meaning, often offered to deities or shared in ceremonies as a symbol of prosperity. Alongside it emerged malpua, a fritter-like treat created from flour or semolina mixed with milk, then fried and bathed in syrup. Each preparation required time, patience, and controlled heat, as the transformation of simple ingredients, milk, grains, ghee, and syrup, into something rich and golden was itself a reflection of devotion. These sweets, while seemingly modest, became markers of festivals, temple rituals, and seasonal observances, anchoring them in daily and spiritual life alike. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The thickening of milk into condensed forms like kheer also demonstrates an early mastery of dairy preservation, as milk, fragile and quick to spoil in warm climates, could be transformed into dishes that lasted longer and nourished more deeply. The grains swelled and softened, the sugars melted into the liquid, and the entire mixture became a quiet meditation in texture, each spoonful a reminder of how culinary practices often grew hand in hand with religious symbolism, carrying both sustenance and prayer in their careful preparation. And so, let us drift gently onward to around 600 CE, where in the expanding Arab world the cultivation and refinement of sugar became central to the creation of new confections. Sugar, derived from cane cultivated in regions stretching from Persia to Mesopotamia, was processed through slow boiling and crystallization, producing syrups and grains that could be shaped, melted, or stored. The development of sugar-based sweets here marked a significant shift away from honey, opening possibilities for candies with more varied textures, from crystalline to glassy, from sticky syrups to smooth pastes. Confections known as halwa, for instance, appeared during this period, made by combining sugar with flour, nuts, or sesame seeds, creating soft, pliant textures that could be molded or sliced. In urban centers like Baghdad and Damascus, sweet making was elevated to an art, often tied to hospitality and medicine as much as to pleasure, with early physicians noting sugar's supposed balancing properties within the body. But first, let us pause for a quiet digression. The sugar itself was not yet abundant or cheap, and its presence in sweets reflected wealth, trade, and connection, as cane required both water and climate control for cultivation. Its journey from cane fields to kitchens involved presses, boiling vats, and careful labor, each step slow and deliberate. Thus, each small sugar confection was not only a delicacy to the tongue but also a visible marker of the interconnectedness of empire, agriculture, and domestic life, where every crystallized grain represented time, effort, and exchange across long distances. Now, with the gentlest of steps, let us wander toward the 800s, where the seeds of what would become Turkish Delight were slowly beginning to take form. In Anatolia and surrounding regions, cooks experimented with reducing grape must, thickened juice left after crushing grapes, into concentrated syrups that could be stabilized with starches, creating sweet, chewy morsels that resembled the earliest ancestors of lokum. These primitive confections were less refined than the sugar-based versions that would follow centuries later, but they carried the same quiet charm of transformation, where fruit and starch combined to yield a texture distinct from simple dried fruit or candied nuts. The chewy density of grape-based sweets offered both novelty and satiety, slowly evolving into a confection that could be flavored with rosewater, herbs, or spices as sugar became more widely available in later centuries. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the use of grape must links these early sweets to winemaking traditions, demonstrating how surplus harvests were creatively adapted, ensuring that nothing from the vineyards went to waste. Over slow fires, syrup thickened and shifted from liquid to semi-solid, a transformation that mirrored the rhythm of the seasons themselves. Each small piece, while simple in appearance, carried within it echoes of agricultural cycles, patient boiling, and the earliest stirrings of culinary invention that would one day crystallize into the soft cubes of Turkish Delight we recognize today, tenderly dusted with starch or sugar, inviting the slowest possible enjoyment with each bite. So gently, let us drift into the medieval centuries around 1000 CE, where sugar, once rare and exotic, began to slowly seep into Europe through the channels of trade, conquest, and careful exchange. At first, sugar was less a household ingredient and more a substance of medicine, catalogued by apothecaries for its supposed healing properties. It was imported in small, crystalline lumps, hard and dense, requiring patient grinding with mortar and pestle before it could be dissolved into syrups or sprinkled over dishes. These early uses of sugar were not yet frivolous, rather, it was seen as a balancing agent for the body, used in electuaries, syrups, and lozenges meant to soothe throats or temper the digestion. But over time, as crusaders returned from the eastern Mediterranean and trade routes extended into Sicily and Iberia where sugarcane could be cultivated, Europe's relationship with sugar began to change. Slowly, it entered the kitchens of nobles, appearing in feasts where it was used to coat nuts, fruits, or even meats, transforming them into curiosities of flavor. The texture of sugar, granular yet capable of melting into liquid smoothness, made it endlessly adaptable, a medium for creativity as much as sweetness. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, sugar was so expensive during this period that it was often kept under lock and key, sometimes stored in ornate boxes or presented to guests in tiny spoonfuls as a display of wealth and refinement. To taste sugar was to taste status, and yet to prepare it required patient labor, long boiling, and careful attention to prevent burning, a process as delicate as the feasts themselves. And now, with the gentlest turn of thought, let us wander to the 1300s, when marzipan began to spread across European courts and cities, a confection so simple in composition and yet so elaborate in its possibilities. At its heart, marzipan is nothing more than almonds and sugar, ground and blended into a pliable paste, yet its texture allowed it to be molded into shapes far beyond the simple sweet. Bakers and confectioners, often working under noble patronage, shaped marzipan into animals, castles, or even miniature scenes, painting them with natural dyes so that what arrived at the table was not only food but art. Almonds, introduced into Europe centuries earlier through trade with the Islamic world, met with sugar in this period to create something that felt both exotic and familiar, both nourishing and ornamental. Marzipan was served at weddings, banquets, and religious festivals, carrying with it a symbolic weight of abundance and delight. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the exact origin of marzipan is still quietly debated among historians, with some suggesting its birthplace was Persia, others pointing to Spain or Italy, yet what remains certain is that its popularity grew swiftly once it reached northern Europe, where cities like Lübeck and Tallinn became renowned for producing their own regional varieties. Each city guarded its recipes carefully, while the process itself demanded time, blanching the almonds, grinding them to a fine meal, then carefully binding them with sugar until the mixture achieved the ideal consistency, firm yet malleable, ready to become both nourishment and decoration. Ever so softly, let us drift onward into the Renaissance world of the 1500s, where sugared almonds and preserved fruits found their way into the feasts and tables of Europe's noble households. Almonds, already valued for their versatility, were coated patiently in layers of sugar syrup, a process requiring repeated boiling, cooling, and stirring, until each nut gleamed with a polished, sweet exterior. These confections, sometimes referred to as comfits, were more than mere indulgences. They were social gestures, offered at banquets or gifted in ornate boxes as tokens of goodwill. Fruits too, from oranges to cherries, were preserved by simmering in heavy sugar syrups, a method that not only extended their shelf life but also transformed them into jeweled delicacies, translucent and glowing under candlelight. The Renaissance was an age of display, and sweets became part of that performance, arranged on elaborate platters, often sculpted into towers or intricate designs to impress guests. But first, let us pause for a quiet aside. The process of preserving fruits in sugar was not a casual task, but a lengthy ritual, requiring careful timing so that the syrup penetrated without collapsing the fruit's form. Each step was deliberate, each stir a slow coaxing of the fruit into its new, candied existence. These sweets, often served at the end of meals, were thought to aid digestion, another echo of sugar's earlier medicinal associations, even as they dazzled the eyes and delighted the palate. Thus, the sugared almond and the candied fruit became small yet telling symbols of Renaissance refinement, where sweetness itself was patiently cultivated into art. So quietly, let us drift into the early 1600s, when chocolate, a treasure carried across the seas from the Americas, began its slow and transformative journey into European life. At first, it was not the sweetened, solid confection we know today, but rather a dark, bitter drink prepared from cacao beans, ground into paste and blended with water or milk. In Mesoamerican cultures, cacao had long held ritual and social significance, often seasoned with chili, maize, or spices, creating a frothy, invigorating beverage. Europeans, curious and experimental, began to soften its sharpness with sugar, cinnamon, and vanilla, slowly reshaping chocolate from a sacred drink into a fashionable indulgence. Served steaming in porcelain cups among the elite of Spain, Italy, and later France, it became a symbol of refinement and exotic taste, cherished for both its flavor and its aura of mystery. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the cacao beans themselves traveled a long path, harvested from tropical pods, fermented gently in the sun, dried, and roasted before they could be ground, each step unfolding like a miniature alchemy of transformation. The grinding produced a paste rich in cocoa butter, and this paste, when mixed with sweeteners, opened entirely new possibilities for European palates. Over the course of the century, chocolate houses emerged in cities such as London and Paris, echoing the role of coffee houses, where conversation flowed alongside steaming cups of sweetened cacao, each sip carrying with it the quiet history of transoceanic trade, patient preparation, and the blending of worlds through taste. And now, as if turning a soft page, let us wander into the 1700s in England, where the humble yet curious licorice root found its way into confectionery. Licorice, derived from the root of Glycyrrhiza glabra, had long been prized for its medicinal qualities, known for soothing throats and aiding digestion, but in the 18th century it began to be shaped deliberately into sweets. Its flavor, earthy and complex, slightly bitter yet sweet at the same time, became the foundation for lozenges, pastilles, and eventually chewy confections. The process of preparing licorice was slow, requiring the root to be boiled gently into a thick extract, reduced until it became a dense, black syrup that could be mixed with sugar or starch. This extract was then molded or cut into small, uniform pieces, suitable for slow enjoyment. But first, let us pause for a little detour. The town of Pontefract in Yorkshire became especially associated with licorice sweets, with local soil favoring the plant's growth and local apothecaries refining its preparation. The famous Pontefract cake, a small round disc stamped with a castle motif, emerged here, straddling the line between medicine and indulgence. Licorice's unique taste was not universally adored, it divided opinions even then, just as it does now, but its durability and distinctiveness gave it staying power, and the slow act of chewing these dark, glossy confections became both a comfort and a curiosity, rooted in tradition, patience, and the enduring charm of a plant that had traveled from ancient herbals into the sweet shops of Georgian England. Ever so softly, we may continue along this same century, to lands further east, where the confection known as Turkish Delight, lokum in its native tongue, was taking shape. Emerging in the Ottoman Empire during the 1700s, this sweet was born from the simple yet magical union of starch and sugar, boiled slowly into a gelatinous mass that, once cooled, could be cut into tender cubes. Flavored with rosewater, citrus, or nuts, each piece was dusted with powdered sugar or starch to prevent sticking, giving it the appearance of snow-kissed jewels. Unlike hard candies, lokum was soft, yielding under the bite, dissolving gently rather than resisting. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Lokum's origins are often tied to confectioners in Istanbul, where the art of sugarcraft had been flourishing for centuries, producing syrups, pastes, and jellies long before this particular form crystallized into popularity. The introduction of cornstarch in later periods refined its texture even further, giving it the delicate consistency it still carries today. Lokum was not just a sweet but a gesture of hospitality, often served with coffee or offered to guests as a sign of warmth and generosity. Its preparation demanded patient stirring, careful boiling, and an unhurried attention to detail, as the line between too soft and too firm was delicate. And so each cube, tender and dusted, represented both craftsmanship and culture, a sweet that spoke not with boldness but with softness, aligning perfectly with the unhurried pace of sharing, savoring, and welcoming. With a quiet step into the early 1800s, the story of sweets takes a tender new turn, as chocolate, which had long been enjoyed in cups and confections, began to take on a form we now recognize as a gift in itself, the first packaged chocolate box. Around this time, in 1818, the English company Whitman's, soon to be known for its elegant Whitman's sampler, introduced chocolates that were not only meant to be eaten but presented in carefully arranged boxes, transforming a simple treat into a thoughtful gesture. These boxes carried assortments, each piece nestled in its own place, inviting curiosity as one lifted the lid and wondered which flavor might be next. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Packaging itself was undergoing quiet revolutions, with decorative printing and sturdier paperboard allowing sweets to be wrapped not just for storage but for beauty and gifting. In many ways, this moment signaled the merging of indulgence and sentiment, as chocolates became tokens of affection, friendship, and celebration. The sight of a ribbon-tied box spoke not only of taste but of thoughtfulness, where the act of giving was wrapped in sweetness and surprise. Each small piece within, sometimes filled with fruits, nuts, or creams, reflected both the expanding possibilities of chocolate making and the growing culture of sharing confections as a language of emotion. The chocolate box, in its patient design, was less about urgency and more about savoring slowly, one bite and one gesture at a time. Drifting softly onward, we find ourselves in 1817, with a story that seems at first modest, but has since grown into one of the world's most beloved and enduring snacks, the potato crisp. In this year, one of the first written recipes for thinly sliced, fried potatoes appeared in William Kitchener's cookbook The Cook's Oracle, a popular English culinary guide of its day. The instructions called for potatoes to be sliced thin, fried carefully in lard until golden, and seasoned lightly with salt, an approach that transformed the humble root into a delicate and crispy indulgence. But first, let us pause for a small detour. The potato itself was still a relatively new arrival in European kitchens, having been brought from the Andes only a few centuries earlier, and its transformation into such a playful, airy snack reflected both experimentation and curiosity in cooking. These early crisps were not mass-produced, of course, but handmade in kitchens, their thinness and crunch offering a delightful contrast to the soft and hearty preparations potatoes were usually given. Over time, this idea, simple, light, and irresistibly crisp, would spread quietly, until it became impossible to imagine the world of snacks without it. In this small moment, the potato crisp emerged not as a grand invention, but as a whisper of change in the way people approached food, showing how something as ordinary as a tuber could, with just a knife and pan of hot fat, become a treat that satisfied with texture as much as taste. And then, like a gentle unfolding of the familiar into something entirely new, we arrive in 1847, when Joseph Fry, a confectioner in Bristol, England, achieved a milestone that would alter the landscape of sweets forever, the creation of the first true chocolate bar. Until this point, chocolate was enjoyed mostly as a drink or in pastes, often rich and decadent but not yet something one could hold in hand and snap with a bite. Fry discovered that by combining cacao powder with sugar and cocoa butter, he could mold the mixture into a solid form that retained its shape yet melted smoothly on the tongue. This innovation was at once simple and profound, as it opened the door to chocolate as a portable, shareable, and endlessly adaptable delight. But first, a slow little detour. The addition of cocoa butter was the quiet alchemy here, for it gave the mixture the right consistency to harden yet soften when eaten, bridging the worlds of firmness and melt. The first bars were plain, dark, and somewhat coarse compared to today's silky versions, but they carried within them the promise of what chocolate would become, a daily comfort, an accessible luxury, and an art form in itself. Holding a piece of Fry's chocolate bar was holding both a treat and a vision of the future, where chocolate would no longer be bound to cups or boxes but could be carried, broken, and savored one square at a time, a transformation so gentle yet so complete that it continues to shape the way sweetness moves through our lives. In the gentle year of 1848, a curious sweetness began not from sugar or chocolate, but from the forests of Maine, where John Curtis introduced something entirely new to the American palate, the first commercial chewing gum. Known as the state of Maine pure spruce gum, it was made from resin collected from spruce trees, a natural substance that had been chewed for generations by indigenous peoples of the region as a soothing pastime and mild breath freshener. Curtis, noticing both its pleasant chew and its potential as a product, boiled and purified the resin, shaping it into small, simple sticks. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, gum at this time contained no sugar, no flavorings beyond the faintly sharp, woodsy tang of spruce, and it was valued as much for the novelty of chewing as for taste. Chewing itself, once a casual habit of rural communities, became quietly commercialized, sold in little packages to townsfolk curious about this forest candy. The experience was not the soft, pliable gum we know today, but firmer, sometimes brittle, breaking before it softened between the teeth. Yet it carried with it the romance of trees, the whisper of pine-filled air, and the gentle ingenuity of turning a natural resin into a pastime of leisure. This humble beginning, rustic and fragrant, would set the stage for chewing gum's transformation into a global phenomenon, proof that even the simplest acts, like chewing a piece of tree resin, can carry the seeds of vast cultural change. And so, with another soft drift forward, we arrive at 1854, when sweets once again took on a form that was not only meant to be consumed but to be admired, preserved, and presented with care, the packaged chocolate box. At this time, Whitman's, a confectionery company in the United States, introduced the first Whitman sampler, a carefully arranged collection of chocolates designed not just to provide flavor but to create an experience of surprise and choice. Each piece was set into its place, inviting the receiver to lift a lid and explore slowly, choosing one chocolate at a time. But first, a quiet pause for a reflective detour. Packaging technology itself was beginning to change, with advances in printing and sturdier cardboard boxes allowing food to be both protected and beautified. Chocolates could now be transported, displayed, and given as gifts in ways that made them more than indulgence. They became tokens of affection, shared in households and gifted between friends and lovers. These boxes carried not only chocolate but anticipation, the gentle wonder of which shape might hide a nut, a fruit filling, or a smooth cream. By presenting chocolates in a sampler, Whitman's helped to establish a tradition of chocolates as gifts, tied to the slow enjoyment of both flavor and presentation, a ritual of unwrapping that made the sweetness last longer than the bite itself. This simple innovation, wrapping confections in care and order, turned candy into an expression of thoughtfulness, where packaging and content danced together in a harmony of taste and gesture. Floating still further into the soft currents of the century, we find ourselves in 1868, when Richard Cadbury, of the famous Cadbury chocolate family in England, offered the world something tender and romantic, the first heart-shaped box of chocolates created specifically for Valentine's Day. By this time, the tradition of exchanging tokens of affection on February 14 had grown popular, with cards and flowers already common, but Cadbury's innovation linked chocolate indelibly to romance. The boxes themselves were ornate, often decorated with cupids, roses, or lace-like embellishments, designed to be kept long after the sweets inside had been savored. But first, let us wander slowly on a soft detour. For this extra interesting fact, Cadbury's idea was not only to sell chocolate but to give lovers a keepsake, a container that could be reused to hold letters, trinkets, or sentimental treasures once the confections were gone. In this way, the chocolate box lived beyond its edible contents, lingering in bedrooms and drawers as a reminder of affection given and received. The chocolates inside were carefully crafted, from smooth creams to nut-filled delights, each one promising a moment of sweetness shared. This gentle intertwining of candy and courtship created a tradition that has endured into the present, where Valentine's Day feels incomplete without the rustle of a ribboned box and the quiet excitement of lifting its lid. In this way, chocolate became not only food but language, a soft, edible expression of love that could be held, unwrapped, and remembered long after the last bite had melted away. With a softness that settles like mist on still waters, we drift to the year 1875, where a gentle revolution in sweetness was unfolding in Switzerland. Here, Daniel Peter, a chocolatier from Vevey, perfected the art of combining cocoa with condensed milk, creating what we now know as milk chocolate. The invention was not sudden but the result of years of delicate trials, as earlier attempts had left chocolate grainy, unstable, or too bitter. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, the condensed milk that made this possible was itself a recent innovation by Henri Nestlé, whose process of evaporating milk into a shelf-stable form provided exactly the creamy smoothness chocolate had been missing. By blending cocoa, sugar, and condensed milk together, Peter created a bar that was lighter, sweeter, and softer than dark chocolate, appealing to palates that preferred mildness over intensity. The texture was velvety, dissolving more easily on the tongue, and the flavor carried the whisper of dairy, transforming chocolate into something that felt both indulgent and comforting. Soon, milk chocolate began spreading across Europe, and eventually the world, becoming the dominant form of chocolate consumed. It was not simply a confection, it was a shift in cultural taste, a step from the dense and bitter toward the creamy and approachable, shaping the very way generations would think of chocolate. This blending of worlds, cocoa from tropical regions and milk from pastoral farms, made milk chocolate a bridge between faraway lands and familiar comforts, a sweet union of opposites that endures softly to this day. As we move with unhurried steps into the 1880s, the story of sweetness takes us not to Europe, but to the bustling kitchens of American confectioners, where a peculiar triangular candy took shape, what we now call candy corn. Created by George Renninger of the Wonderly Candy Company, these little pieces were molded from sugar, corn syrup, marshmallow, and fondant, each crafted in 3 colored layers of white, orange, and yellow. But first, let us linger on a soft detour. For this extra interesting fact, the choice of shape was deliberate, echoing kernels of corn, which in the 19th century carried a rustic, wholesome image tied to agriculture and harvest. Candy corn was initially marketed not as a Halloween sweet, but as chicken feed, a playful nod to its resemblance to grains that might be scattered in a barnyard. Its chewy texture, waxy sheen, and simple flavor of honey and vanilla made it inexpensive and easy to produce in large quantities, and it soon became popular among rural and urban families alike. By the early 20th century, as Halloween emerged as a widely celebrated holiday in the United States, candy corn slipped quietly into its new role as the season's emblematic treat. Its tricolored stripes, cheerful and bright, evoked autumn fields and harvest festivals, tying the candy to imagery of abundance and warmth. Today, it lingers as a divisive sweet, beloved by some, disliked by others, yet its survival across more than a century is a testament to its place in the cultural imagination, where even the simplest shapes can become icons of tradition. And so, with another gentle breath, we reach the year 1891, when in Cincinnati, Ohio, the Dosher Brothers Confections Company began producing what they called French chew. This candy, unlike the crisp snap of chocolate or the waxy smoothness of candy corn, was a chewy taffy-like creation, stretching slowly between the teeth with a softness that demanded patience. Made from sugar, corn syrup, and flavorings such as chocolate or vanilla, it was boiled, pulled, and cooled into pliable slabs that could be cut into pieces or bitten in long, lingering stretches. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The process of candy pulling, which involves aerating the sugar mixture by folding and stretching it repeatedly, was essential not only to French chew but to many taffy-like confections. This action trapped tiny air bubbles, giving the candy its light, soft chew rather than a rigid hardness. The Dosher brothers packaged their French chew as a nostalgic, comforting sweet, reminiscent of handmade taffy from fairs in seaside towns, though it was firmly rooted in Midwestern kitchens and factories. Its slow, stretchy quality made it a candy not to be rushed but savored, a treat that seemed to ask for a pause, a moment of idle chewing while conversations meandered or afternoons passed unhurriedly. Over time, French chew became a beloved regional specialty, still produced more than a century later, showing how even the simplest blend of sugar and patience can endure softly across generations, carrying with it the quiet charm of chewy sweetness. With a soft drift into the opening years of the 1900s, we find ourselves in the quiet town of Dairy Church, Pennsylvania, where Milton S. Hershey transformed the world of chocolate with something both simple and profound, the Hershey's Milk Chocolate Bar. Before this moment, chocolate in the United States was often expensive, sometimes brittle, and usually imported, but Hershey dreamed of creating a bar that was smooth, sweet, and affordable enough for everyday enjoyment. By adapting European techniques and blending them with his own careful adjustments, he succeeded in stabilizing milk chocolate for mass production, turning what had been a luxury into something accessible to the general public. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Hershey's method introduced a slightly tangy, almost caramel-like note to the chocolate, a flavor that came from the controlled treatment of milk before it was mixed with cocoa. This unique taste, sometimes described as faintly sour, became a defining characteristic of the Hershey bar, making it instantly recognizable and tied to American identity itself. The bar's neat rectangular shape, its foil wrapping, and the familiar lettering on the paper sleeve gave it a uniform reliability that appealed across generations. Each square could be broken off, shared, or savored in solitude, its simplicity masking the quiet complexity of industrial efficiency. With the Hershey bar, chocolate became not only a sweet but a symbol of comfort, reaching from lunchboxes to campfires, from childhood treats to wartime rations, embedding itself so gently into the fabric of American life that it almost feels eternal. As the decades drifted onward like leaves on a slow stream, the year 1921 introduced a candy bar whose name carried with it a curious link to one of the most famous figures in American sport, the Baby Ruth bar. Produced by the Curtis Candy Company, this confection combined peanuts, caramel, and nougat, all wrapped in a layer of chocolate, creating a hearty, filling bar that was marketed as both candy and sustenance. Its name has long been associated in popular memory with the baseball legend Babe Ruth, though the company maintained, perhaps to avoid legal entanglements, that it was named after Ruth Cleveland, the daughter of former President Grover Cleveland, who had passed away decades earlier. But first, a soft little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The marketing of Baby Ruth bars was as inventive as the candy itself. Curtis arranged for bars to be dropped by parachute from airplanes, fluttering down to city streets, delighting children and adults alike who rushed to catch them. The bar's chewy, nutty density made it more than a quick sweet, it lingered in the mouth, a slow experience of layered textures that gave it staying power in a marketplace crowded with competitors. Its name, wrapped in the aura of sports or politics depending on whom you believed, created a sense of connection to American culture, binding candy not only to flavor but to stories and symbols. The Baby Ruth bar thus drifted into history as more than a sweet, it became a narrative, edible and enduring, quietly embedding itself in public imagination with every chewy bite. And so, with gentle ease, we arrive in 1923, when the Mars Company introduced a bar that was inspired by something many already loved in soda fountains, the malted milkshake. This was the Milky Way bar, a confection that carried within it nougat flavored with malt, layered with caramel, and enrobed in chocolate, creating a bar that felt both light and indulgent at once. The intention was not merely to provide sweetness but to mimic, in solid form, the creamy, frothy pleasure of a milkshake, allowing people to enjoy the sensation of that popular drink without needing to visit a diner or soda fountain. But first, let us pause for a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Malted milk powder itself had been developed in the late 19th century as a nutritional supplement, marketed as healthful for children and the sick, long before it became associated with milkshakes and candy. By incorporating it into the Milky Way bar, Mars tapped into a flavor that felt both wholesome and modern, giving the bar an identity that stretched beyond mere indulgence. The bar was also substantial in size, sold at a price that gave buyers the sense of value, which contributed to its rapid rise in popularity. Its soft interior, contrasted by the firmer chocolate coating, created a textural play that echoed the contrast between creamy shakes and their frothy tops. In this way, the Milky Way was more than candy, it was an attempt to bottle the essence of a cultural moment, a translation of soda fountain joy into portable, pocket-sized form, drifting softly into countless hands and memories. With a hushed gentleness, let us drift into the year 1937, when Nestlé introduced a small but meaningful change to the world of chocolate, the Nestlé Crunch Bar. Until then, most chocolate bars had been solid, smooth, and uniform, but this bar introduced puffed rice into the mixture, giving each bite a light, crackling texture. It was not an extravagant change, but one of those quiet innovations that redefined what a chocolate bar could be. But first, a soft little detour. For this extra interesting fact. Puffed rice itself had been around since the early 20th century, made possible by steam popping processes that transformed ordinary rice into airy, crisp morsels. By folding this humble grain into chocolate, Nestlé created a contrast of textures, the firm richness of cocoa against the gentle crunch of puffed rice, that delighted those who preferred variety in each mouthful. The bar also carried practical advantages, stretching the chocolate further while making the product more affordable during a time when economies fluctuated. The name itself, Crunch, said everything one needed to know, highlighting the textural play that made it different from the smoother bars that came before. Over the years, the Nestlé Crunch Bar became both a staple and a comfort, its lightness appealing to those who wanted something less dense, less overwhelming, but still satisfying. It demonstrated how even the smallest changes, adding a grain, altering a texture, could create new traditions in sweetness, drifting into homes and lunchboxes as if it had always belonged there. As we move slowly into the 1940s, the world was in the grip of war, and sweets were no longer made only for pleasure, but often for practicality. It was during this time that M&Ms were created, designed with a simple yet brilliant solution to one of chocolate's oldest inconveniences, its tendency to melt and heat. Forrest Mars, Sr., inspired by chocolate pellets coated in sugar that had been observed in Europe, patented the idea of candy-coated chocolate drops in 1941. But first, let us pause for a thoughtful detour. For this extra interesting fact. The hard candy shell was not only protective but also gave the candies their famous slogan, "Melts in your mouth, not in your hand," a phrase introduced later that perfectly captured their appeal. Originally produced for American soldiers, M&Ms were packaged in cardboard tubes that made them easy to carry in pockets or ration kits, resistant to the heat of battlefields and travel. Their colors, initially muted, grew brighter after the war, with reds, yellows, greens, and browns turning them into cheerful little tokens of sweetness. What made M&Ms enduring was not just their practicality, but their playful size, their crunchy shell followed by the soft yielding of chocolate inside, a layered experience in miniature. From their military origins, they transitioned easily into civilian life, becoming a favorite of children and adults alike, proof that a candy designed for necessity could also become a universal pleasure. They remain a reminder that even in difficult times, sweetness finds its way into everyday life, protected in small, colorful shells. Drifting softly into the 1950s, we find a quieter chapter, one shaped not by invention but by resurgence, the return of penny candy to popularity. Though candy had long been sold in small, affordable portions, post-war prosperity and the culture of neighborhood shops brought about a renewed affection for tiny, inexpensive sweets that children could purchase with just a coin or two. These were not grand confections or elaborately packaged bars, but humble treats, jawbreakers, licorice whips, peppermint sticks, and gumdrops, lined up in glass jars behind counters or displayed in bins where small hands could point and choose. But first, a soft little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The phrase penny candy did not always mean candy literally costing 1 cent, but referred more broadly to inexpensive confections that even the youngest customer could afford. Shopkeepers often sold them individually, wrapped in wax paper or handed out in tiny paper bags, each choice a small adventure in flavor and color. The ritual of selecting penny candy was as meaningful as the eating itself, teaching children the value of money, the joy of choice, and the patience of savoring something small. In many ways, penny candy represented the democratization of sweetness, ensuring that no matter one's age or wealth, a little taste of sugar was always within reach. Its endurance in memory, often spoken of with nostalgia, is less about the candy itself than the experience, the wooden counters, the sound of coins clinking, the anticipation of unwrapping something small yet perfectly sufficient. It was a gentle reminder that sweetness could be measured not in size or luxury, but in moments of simple delight. With a kind of gentle unfolding, let us wander into the bright and playful world of the 1960s, when colorful sugar-based candies began to blossom into ever more imaginative forms. These were the years when candy became not only about sweetness but also about spectacle, with colors and shapes that seemed to dazzle the eyes as much as they delighted the tongue. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The mid-20th century brought advances in food dyes and flavoring agents, allowing candy makers to experiment more freely with vivid hues and novel tastes. It was during this time that candies became miniature celebrations of design, swirls of rainbow lollipops, jewel-like hard sweets, and striped sticks that looked almost too pretty to eat. For children, the experience was as much about holding something radiant in their hands as it was about savoring the sugar on their tongues. These brightly colored creations also mirrored the spirit of the decade, an era marked by playful experimentation, expanding consumer culture, and a fascination with youth. Candy stores became galleries of edible art, every counter a glowing display of glass jars filled with treasures waiting to be chosen. Each purchase, often just a few coins, carried with it not only flavor but an identity, whether one preferred the cheerful sharpness of citrus drops, the cool clarity of peppermint, or the slow dissolve of a striped candy cane. The 1960s thus marked a turning point, when candy embraced both variety and personality, offering sweetness in shades as bold and imaginative as the times themselves. Softly, we drift into the 1970s, where candy making began to push further into the realm of invention, bringing textures that surprised and amused as much as they satisfied. This was the decade when playful novelties like Pop Rocks and Ring Pops entered the scene, adding a layer of wonder to the act of eating. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact, Pop Rocks were created by accident, the result of research into ways of carbonating candy by trapping pressurized carbon dioxide inside sugar. The discovery meant that when the crystals dissolved on the tongue, they released tiny bursts of gas, producing a crackling sensation that seemed almost magical, like carrying a tiny fireworks show in one's mouth. Alongside them came Ring Pops, which transformed candy into wearable jewelry, bright, gem-like sweets perched on plastic rings, allowing children to wear and savor their treasure at the same time. The 1970s were a time of playful innovation, when candy was not merely consumed but performed, shared, and shown off. It was candy as a toy, as an accessory, as a tiny act of theater in everyday life. These creations reflected a shift toward novelty and fun, echoing the decade's fascination with pop culture, bold fashion, and new experiences. For many, the memory of candy from this era is inseparable from the feeling of play, the delight of discovering that sweetness could tingle, fizz, or sparkle in new and unexpected ways. With a hushed and flowing ease, let us step into the 1980s, when chewy candies began to take center stage, drawing people into their soft resistance and tangy bursts. This was the decade when Skittles and Sour Patch Kids gained popularity, both offering chewy textures but with very different appeals. But first, a gentle detour. For this extra interesting fact, Skittles were originally developed in the United Kingdom in 1974 but made their way to the United States in 1979, quickly becoming a household favorite during the 1980s with their famous call to taste the rainbow. Their charm lay in the variety, small bites packed with different fruity flavors, bright colors, and a chewy consistency that kept the sweetness lingering. Sour Patch Kids, by contrast, offered a layered experience, beginning with a tangy sour coating that awakened the tongue, then giving way to the gentler sweetness of the gummy beneath. The very structure of these candies created a journey in each bite, one of sharpness followed by softness, of surprise followed by comfort. The 1980s were a time when candy reflected diversity and boldness, echoing the larger cultural landscape of neon fashion, arcade games, and lively music videos. Candy was no longer just about sweetness, it was about personality, variety, and memorable experiences. For many children of this era, a small bag of Skittles or Sour Patch Kids was more than candy, it was a statement of taste, a token of belonging to a generation that loved things bright, bold, and a little bit daring. Drifting onward with a slow, thoughtful rhythm, we arrive in the 1990s, when the intensity of sour candies reached its height and captured the imaginations of children and teenagers alike. Warheads became one of the most iconic confections of this era, pushing the boundaries of flavor to extremes few had dared before. But first, a soft little detour. For this extra interesting fact, Warheads were originally developed in Taiwan in 1975, but they gained remarkable popularity in the United States during the 1990s, their distribution beginning in earnest in 1993. What set them apart was their startling sour coating, made from malic acid, which produced an almost shocking sensation on the tongue before gradually dissolving into a gentler sweetness. This dramatic transformation made each piece of candy a challenge as much as a treat, with children daring one another to endure the intense sourness for as long as possible. The very act of eating a warhead became a kind of playful rite, a test of bravery in schoolyards and playgrounds, where laughter mingled with puckered faces and wide-eyed gasps. The popularity of such sour confections spoke to a cultural trend of the time, when bold, extreme flavors mirrored the spirit of experimentation and competitiveness that characterized much of the decade's youth culture. Sour candies became not only treats but games, small adventures and intensity that bonded friends through shared experience. For many, the memory of the 1990s in candy form is not of sweetness alone, but of daring and laughter, moments when flavor itself was pushed to the edge, and children delighted in conquering the sharpness together. With a soft drifting step, we arrive in the candy landscape of the 2000s, a decade when sweetness began to experiment with bold new personalities. It was no longer enough for candy to be simply sugary and playful, it began to flirt with extremes, with daring combinations that blended sweet, sour, and even spicy into one curious experience. But first, a slow little detour. For this extra interesting fact. These shifts were tied closely to broader changes in food culture, where adventurous eaters sought out novelty and intensity, influenced by global flavors becoming ever more accessible. Candies began to echo this trend, offering hot chili-laced lollipops in Latin American tradition, fiery cinnamon chews that seemed to warm the tongue, and confections that blended tart fruitiness with tingling sour powders. Each piece was not merely a sweet but an experience, a small performance of surprise, challenge, and discovery. For children, these candies became dares among friends, much like the warheads of the decade before, but now with added dimensions of heat or unusual flavor profile. For adults, they were reminders that candy could be daring as well as comforting, playful as well as experimental. The 2000s candy aisle became something like a stage of variety, where flavor stretched the imagination, daring the eater to try something just a little more unusual than before. And then, with a flowing gentleness, the path curves us into the 2010s, when the conversation around candy began to shift toward craftsmanship and refinement. This was the era when artisanal and gourmet chocolates rose in popularity, with consumers becoming increasingly interested in quality, origin, and story. But first, a quiet little detour. For this extra interesting fact. The rise of gourmet chocolate was linked to a wider cultural movement of foodie appreciation, where people wanted to know where their food came from, how it was made, and why it mattered. Chocolatiers began to emphasize single-origin cacao, small-batch roasting, and delicate flavor profiles, turning chocolate into something closer to wine or coffee, a product with depth, terroir, and subtlety. Bars were wrapped in elegant packaging, often decorated with notes about the farm or cooperative where the cacao had been grown, or the percentage of cacao content that defined its strength. For many, tasting these chocolates became a quiet ritual, savoring the bitterness of dark blends, the richness of milk varieties, or the delicate inclusion of spices, sea salt, or dried fruit. The 2010s reminded the world that candy could be more than a quick indulgence, it could be a thoughtful, almost meditative experience, connecting the eater to landscapes, traditions, and craftspeople far away. In this way, candy softened into both luxury and art, holding within it stories as rich as the flavors it carried. With the gentlest of pauses, we step softly into the 2020s, where candy once again reflects broader shifts in how people live, eat, and dream of the future. This is the decade when plant-based and healthier candy options began to emerge more widely, shaped by health-conscious consumers and a growing awareness of sustainability. But first, a meandering detour. For this extra interesting fact. Plant-based alternatives in candy are part of a much older history of sweets made without animal products, such as fruit pastes, nut brittles, and sugar confections. Yet in the 2020s, these options became deliberate, marketed as alternatives to traditional candy that often contained dairy, gelatin, or heavy refined sugars. Chocolate makers began experimenting with oat milk, almond milk, and coconut milk to create creamy textures without animal ingredients, while gummy producers turned to pectin and other plant-based gelling agents instead of gelatin. Alongside these shifts came an interest in natural sweeteners, reduced sugar, and added nutritional elements, with candy seeking to satisfy both the longing for sweetness and the desire for balance. For many, this meant candy could become part of everyday life without guilt, a treat aligned with mindful living and environmental care. The candy aisle of the 2020s reflects this gentle change, filled with bright wrappers promising indulgence, but also wellness, sustainability, and kindness toward the planet. It is candy reimagined for a new century, carrying with it both nostalgia for the joy of sweetness and hope for a softer, more thoughtful future. With a soft, unhurried breath, we drift onward toward 2024 to 2025, where candy begins to dance in even more unusual and mindful ways. This is the era when innovation and health consciousness intertwine with playfulness, bringing both curiosity and comfort to the confectionery aisle. But first, a gentle detour. For this extra interesting fact. Many of the trends emerging now are echoes of decades past, yet they carry a new layer, a dialogue with global flavors, functional ingredients, and interactive experiences. Candies are not just sweet bites, they are small narratives, combining textures, temperatures, and flavors in ways that surprise and delight. By 2024, the focus on plant-based and reduced sugar confections expanded further, now joined by functional candies infused with vitamins, probiotics, or calming adaptogens. These treats gently suggest that indulgence need not be at odds with wellness, softly whispering that a moment of pleasure can coexist with mindfulness. Spicy sweet or spicy flavors emerged with boldness, blending chili or cayenne with fruity or gummy bases, offering a tiny adventure in every bite. Meanwhile, exotic and floral notes, like hibiscus, rose, and lavender, appeared in chocolates, gummies, and even hard candies, creating experiences that felt aromatic, soothing, and unexpectedly sophisticated. Even natural fruit concentrates, monk fruit sweeteners, and stevia were increasingly used, allowing for sweetness without excessive sugar, and giving candies a nuanced flavor profile that appealed to both adults and children alike. Packaging too embraced both delight and conscience, with smaller, shareable portions designed for moderation, and recyclable or biodegradable materials nodding to environmental care. Even candy shapes and textures invited interaction, chewiness, popping sensations, and layered flavors encouraged slow exploration, turning a quick snack into a mini ritual. By 2025, some brands began experimenting with limited edition or viral-inspired flavors, like tropical mango gummies or collaborative creations that nod to social trends, allowing confectionery to remain playful, relevant, and ever-evolving. Additionally, some companies incorporated QR codes linking to immersive stories, recipes, or sustainability information, connecting consumers with the origins and purpose behind their treats in a quiet, thoughtful way. You may wish to linger a little longer, drifting softly between thought and sensation, noticing the gentle hues of wrappers, the quiet promise of sweetness, and the careful consideration that has gone into each little treat. Perhaps you imagine a slow, meandering path through a candy shop filled not with haste or clamor, but with patience and attention, where each morsel sits like a tiny jewel, waiting to be discovered, savored, and appreciated ever so gently. Even the act of unwrapping, a small crinkle of paper, carries a subtle, almost imperceptible rhythm, a whisper of anticipation that requires no urgency. This quiet ritual, this soft, deliberate pause, allows us to notice the textures, the gentle smells, and the quiet artistry of what is often overlooked. You may not care. And that is completely fine. Yet even in this unremarkable attention, there is a slow satisfaction, a calm observation that folds into the spaces between thoughts, filling them with soft, mundane beauty. If your eyes are closed, if your thoughts are drifting, then my job here is done for today. Thank you for spending this unremarkable moment with me. You have listened to The Sleepy Sloth, where uninteresting things become the softest lullabies.